Today we're going to talk about coolers and which one's right for you, considering there's a lot of, I don't want to say confusion, but there's a lot of questions now with the higher TDP and temperature of modern CPUs. So we'll talk about the 3 different major cooler types and which one might be right or wrong for you.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
I mentioned the high TDPs of modern CPUs. I mean, AM5 CPUs when they first came out with 7000 series would get up to 95C, even with decent coolers. Same thing with obviously 13th gen and 14th gen Intel. They're known to get very, very warm, especially i9 CPUs, with many motherboards pushing their TDPs well beyond 300 watts at this point. So let's talk about the 3 major categories. First of all, as you can see to your left, there is air coolers. In the middle here, I have an AIO, which stands for an all-in-one or liquid cooler. And then over here, we have a bunch of components for custom open loop type stuff. And open loop refers to the fact that it is not a sealed system. Like closed loop AIOs means that they're sealed up. They're really, most of the time, non-serviceable. And they're a wear and tear item, which means when they wear out, they wear out. So let's start with air coolers here. There is a wide range of air coolers available on the market. I mean, this right here is the Vitru, it's like a $20 air cooler from Amazon. Definitely gets the job done on more like regular types of CPUs. I'd say like i5s or mid-range AMDs, things that aren't not pushing the envelope of 253 watts and beyond. Obviously for those higher end CPUs, I have a Noctua D15 right here. This is one of the newer like black ones, which obviously has, as you can see just by looking at it, you can see it's like double the amount of cooling on this, just visually anyway, versus the standard cooler here. Now when it comes to air coolers, they have a lot of pros. And what I mean by lots of pros is, one, they tend to be fairly cost effective, although many of the big twin tower type of coolers like you see here with the Noctua can cost more than an all-in-one liquid cooler. But typically they can be cost effective, or you can spend 60, 70, 80 bucks on a decent high-end air cooler and get the job done. Also too, they have no parts to wear out with the exception of the fan bearing. There's nothing in here that needs to be serviced, except maybe your thermal paste over time. Almost every single air cooler on the market these days is a vapor chamber style, which means we have a vapor chamber that's in the cold plate right here, and then these heat pipes, which are copper, carry that heat away through a wicking technology, which means as the vapor gets hot, because of the heat being transferred to it from the CPU, it wicks that heat through, or that takes that heat towards the end of the pipe through a wicking process. There's actually a wick in there. And then as it cools, it turns back to a liquid, it comes in the bottom, collects, gets hot, and it just repeats that process. It does it very quickly though. It's actually a very fast process. And then the fan just brings cold air through the heat sink, which then makes that heat then get caught into the cold air because heat wants to move the cold, and then exhausts it through as a heat exchanger. They can be very, very effective. Brands like Noctua actually have been trying to perfect the air cooler now, and they've even come out with new versions of their air coolers, which are like LBC and HBC and standard. And that's specifically because of the concave type designs you find in Intel IHSs, and then AMDs tend to have a more convex type of a domed, if you will, domed IHS. So they started to even figure out that you can get a few degrees of additional cooling by making sure that the CPU cold plate, or CPU IHS and the cold plate match the shape. And that's something new they've actually come out with. Steve actually did a great video showing through their laser scanner what that shape looks like. Anyway, moving on. The same type of technology exists in these cheaper coolers, but they have their limitations. They are quite a bit slower at the amount of heat that they can transfer and dissipate through this process than, say, liquid. Not only that, liquid has a higher thermal mass to it, which means that it can absorb more heat and theoretically give you even better cooling. Now, cons are the fact that they have their limitations. They can only handle so much TDP before they become so massive they start to interfere with things in your cooler, in your case, and your motherboard, for instance. So you can see there's these notches under here, because one of the biggest problem with air coolers for the longest time is to get bigger, they had to expand farther over the motherboard, which meant impact with RAM, and they would RAM getting faster now requires additional cooling as well, so the heat sinks get taller and then they would interfere. But you can see we had this notch cut out to give us more RAM clearance. Unfortunately, that's that much more fins or less fins that we have to give us additional space for cooling. They can only be so tall. The taller they get, the less cases they'll be compatible with. So they can really only get so large before they become impractical to fit in your system. The size, not just the vapor chamber, the amount of heat pipes and all that, the amount of fins they have, the material they're made out of, and their overall size are what determine their limitations regarding cooling. So something like the D15 would definitely handle up to an i9 just fine, but they have limited capabilities when it comes to overclocking, because as you push that TDP, you just can easily push the TDP right beyond the limitations of the air cooler itself. Then you start hitting 95, 100 C, and then you start dealing with thermal throttling at that point. So this is where the pros of liquid come in. Now there's different types of liquid coolers, as I've mentioned. This right here just happens to be a Corsair Link unit. Just grabbed it off the shelf for no particular reason. This happens to be a 360 variant, which means we have 3 120 millimeter fans. You can get them in sizes from 120, which means just one fan, 240, 2 fans, or 360, 3 fans, and you can get them in 140 millimeter variants for a 140 or a 280. And 280 tends to be the most common one when it comes to 140 fans. It's rare to find a 420. They do exist, but they're rare. Now this gives you a higher TDP or thermal limit to what kind of heat it can dissipate, because liquid itself does have a higher thermal density to it. It means the liquid can hold more heat than air itself can. Now, we're still limited by the amount of heat that we can transfer through a heat exchanger. So the fins in the AIO work very similar to the heat sink fins found on an air cooler. The difference is we're just using air now to push through these fins, and as the hot fluid goes through the radiator rows and that heat is dissipated into the fins, the cold air is moved through the heat exchanger, pulls the heat away, and then that process just continues. So vapor chambers tend to work the same way as like liquid coolers, essentially, in that it's taking heat and wicking it and moving it away from a location, whereas we're using fluid here and a pump to move the fluid. Now, pros, like I said, they have more thermal mass to it, which means they can hold more heat, which gives them a higher TDP typically. Another pro is the fact that they're fairly low profile. I mean, with the exception of the additional thickness to our radiator here, which is about 30 millimeters, you're gonna be putting case fans in there anyway. So that kind of sits up there where your fans are gonna be, whether it's in the front of the case or the top of the case. And then we have tubing, which is carrying the fluid to where we need it, and then this is going to where our CPU is. So you can see the size of this block pump combo versus the size of this air cooler. We're not gonna interfere with things like VRMs, and we're not gonna interfere with our RAM. It's just really sort of low profile versus what you'd get with a big giant air cooler that has an equal TDP to something like a 360 AIO. Downsides though, there's more moving parts. Obviously we've got our fans on here, but we have our pump, which also is a wear and tear item. Typically AIOs are good for about 5 years. Now there's some things that can happen over time. One, the pump itself could just wear out. A lot of brands these days are using either Asetek or Appletech rebrands, which means there's a major manufacturer that is then selling the patent, the licensing to be able to put their name on it. And then what brands are able to do is anything that goes on the pump itself, whether it be an LCD screen, that's another pro, is the fact that you can customize it with LCD screens and have temperature showing, like a little mini display on there, have animated GIFs, just make your PC more custom, feel more premium. With that comes a premium price, obviously, because now we're well beyond the price point of what an air cooler would be. The pumps themselves tend to be the most wear and tear item. Also too, even though we do have a sealed system here, which is not serviceable, there's no ports to refill our fluid or anything, over time, through the rubber that the tubing is made out of, you will lose some coolant to evaporation. Even though it's sealed and vacuum sealed, through permeation, some of that fluid will get lost to the atmosphere over time. So then what happens is you start to get a little bit more air in the system. The air can make its way to the pump, it gets noisy, it starts to aerate. Those bubbles get mixed into the fluid, which means now you have air introduced with the coolant, which means less efficient heat transfer from the CPU into the fluid. And then eventually death of the pump itself. Permeation or air in the pump is the worst thing for it. So because it's non-serviceable means it is a throwaway item when it goes bad. If it goes bad within that warranty period, you're out the time to remove it, send it in for RMA, get the return unit and reinstall it. So air coolers, like I said, they never go bad. The vapor chamber doesn't evaporate, it doesn't go bad, it doesn't leak any of the wicking fluid that's in there. The worst thing that would happen is your fan goes bad, and that's an easy swap. And with them being technically a throwaway part when they go bad, it's a pretty expensive investment. So for instance, this Noctua D15 Chromax is $129, which is a pretty expensive air cooler, but not the most expensive. You can find air coolers from Noctua that are into the $200. But the H150i from Corsair here, this is a $239 AIO. So we're now putting ourselves into a very significant investment on what the cost is. Now there's various things that will determine the cost. Like this is their link AIO, so you can see it's got the big link connectors right here. There's no wires or anything going to the pump at all, so it's a very clean setup because of the fact that it all runs through this hub here and the wires are in the tubing, or in the sleeving anyway. They've got their RGB fans. These are like the most expensive fans they sell. So this is a very pricey unit. Obviously you can get smaller ones like 240s and whatnot that will cost even less, but $239 for an AIO is pretty significant considering back in the, just not that long ago, you could easily find sub $100 AIOs and 360 with no problem whatsoever. Now another drawback is if you're going with a brand that doesn't have something like Link, or even their older stuff, you have wires for each fan, you have RGB cables for each fan, you have the pump power itself, which is gonna probably be like a SATA cable, you've got the pump RPM wire, which has to be plugged in somewhere in the motherboard so it knows how fast the pump is turning, you might have an RGB cable coming off of the pump, you might have a USB cable coming off of the pump going to the motherboard so it can communicate. And then it become a bit of a cluttered wiring nightmare. They've gotten better over time. A lot of brands are doing daisy chaining now and running wires within the tubing to hide a lot of that stuff. But it's more of a hassle when it comes to install, and even more of a hassle if it's all cable managed tightly with bundles of wires and you have to take it out because something took a shit. And then you got to undo all that. So again, with the air cooler, you just have the fan cable and that's pretty much it. Maybe an RGB cable as well if there's any sort of like shroud that has RGB or something on it. Now again, these also do have their limitations. They have their limitations because of the fact that the cold plate, which is the copper or the metal piece touching your CPU, is extremely thin versus something like an open loop custom component. So it's very thin, which means its thermal mass is also low. And not only that, it has to be able to account for the pump and everything, which is right on top of it. So because of that, you're also limited to the ways that you can orient your coolers. For instance, having the radiator on the bottom like this with your pump on the top would not be a great idea because air would get trapped up here right above the pump. It can get sucked in, then you aerate it like I said, which ends up leading to premature pump death because air in the pump is the fastest way to kill it. So you have to make sure that your tubing and at least the top of the radiator is above the CPU. So mounted in the front like that or mounted on top like that. It's just, you're limited now to where you can install it. Some cases on the market only allow for bottom mounted radiators, which is bad for an AIO. Which now brings us to this pile of stuff. And this is really starting to look like a Corsair sponsored video. I swear it's not. I just went into my shelf and started grabbing stuff, okay? So now we're talking about open loop. Open loop simply means each component is separate and you have to buy the components, assemble them yourself, make sure everything's compatible, etc. So this is just an Alpha Cool pump reservoir combo. It's glass. The D5 pump would go down here. I don't have one installed right now. So you'd have to source that separately. Here's just a XC7 water block, which would be installed on your motherboard. This is a big old giant beefy D5 pump by itself, like not a combo in any means. So normally the pump would be down here under the single unit like that. So I prefer combos versus separate units, but I just wanted to show like just what the components look like individually. So this is a Coolstream radiator from EK, one that we took out one of our systems that we're not using the EK stuff anymore. But you can now add other components to your loop, which you can't do with an AIO. Back in the day, they tried to do expandable AIOs, where they use standard threads, like G-quarter threads. You could actually drain the system, take it out, add a GPU block or something, add some tubing and put it in. The problem is these pumps, they may look all big and beefy. Like if we look at the size of this and this, they may seem somewhat comparable. But keep in mind, this is mostly just a RGB top on there. The pump really is only this part. Right there, it's very tiny. This is the pump for this guy. This is an acrylic top. You can see we got our ports and stuff on here. The D5 is taking up everything underneath the acrylic part right here. So the amount of head pressure that this pump can create is many, many, many times what an AIO pump can handle. So what we found as we start to try and expand the AIOs and you add more resistance to them, those pumps do a terrible job of actually being able to move the coolant. Getting them bled and getting all the air out of there without a reservoir is also extremely difficult. Once you start taking it apart and adding other components, now you're in open loop territory of cost because you're adding the other components and cost. So it makes sense at that point to just go full open loop. So you can really, there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of combinations of parts that you can put together. And that's where one of the major drawbacks is with open loop is making sure everything is compatible, making sure that you have all the right fittings, making sure that you have enough tubing, that the tubing size and diameter is correct for your fittings, making sure your loop order is correct, planning out your loop and where everything's gonna go. How are you going to do some sort of a pump res combo like this that's now mounted to your fans, which is now mounted to your radiator to have it all kind of, at this point, almost all in one, if you will? Or are you going to do a hidden pump system down in the basement of your computer where you now have to have a reservoir feeding this somewhere? How are you going to make sure there's no conflicts? Are you going to make sure your radiators are going to fit in your case without impacting each other? Or then realizing you put the radiators in and they don't impact, but now you have a fitting hidden behind another radiator and you can't get to it and there's no room to get tubing out. These are all things that happen when you start getting into open loop territory because it's not a universal experience regarding installing them in different cases that exist in the market. Another thing, making sure your case is compatible with the components that you want. It might fit 3 120 millimeter fans, but that doesn't mean it's going to fit a 100 or 360 millimeter radiator, because the radiators, as you can see, they have end tanks, right? So the fluid has to be able to turn around somehow. So we've got an end tank here, which is also wider than the other end tank on the other side because we have to account for our G-quarter threads here to get our fittings on there. So you add that thickness and this thickness to the fan widths, then you start to realize like, oh crap, it's not actually gonna fit. Or is it gonna impact, when it's mounted to the top, your motherboard heat sinks because of the fact that it's too close to the motherboard and hangs down too low because your case doesn't have enough space above the ATX mounting holes to be able to account for that sort of height. So those are the kinds of drawbacks that you get with open loop. It's just making sure everything's compatible. And that's besides the obvious of if it leaks, it can cause damage in your system. Now we've shown that it takes quite a bit of effort to actually kill or even damage or even get a computer to shut off with fluid. I have completely doused motherboards and then have them shut off while running. Simply dry them off and everything's up and running. But that does not mean that you won't have a magic drip that hit just the right component with just the right amount of short to kill it. I mean, of course it happens. It can happen and it happens all the time. So that's a severe drawback. Another drawback is the price. We are now talking hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of components, potentially even $1,000 plus, depending on the grade of component you go with. You've got your Amazon specials that cost 20, 30 bucks for a block, or maybe 50 bucks for a radiator or whatever, but now you're in questionable quality territory. And if it's not gonna last any longer than an AIO, what was the benefit? Because the benefit of an open loop is the fact that it will last many, many years. And it's serviceable. You can top off the coolant as it starts to get low. You can change out the coolant if it starts to pick up debris from any of the components. It's impossible to get the loop to be debris-free forever. Something somewhere will break loose from a rad, some piece of flux or something will break off at some point, and you'll see it floating around in your loop and it starts to really bug you. Or you might get discoloration of your tubing that just starts to bother you, so you take it apart, change your tubing to something else and keep it running. So the serviceability, upgradability, and the lifespan of an open loop far, far superior to an AIO. So when it comes to pros, you can expand the heat capacity of it. So the heat capacity is determined by the radiator size itself. So you've got a million different options for radiator brands, sizes, 1, 2, 360, 1, 2, 3, 480. So you can add another 120 if you wanted, or you can go 140 fans up to 560 millimeters, or you can even find radiators from brands like Alpha Cool, which are like 480 by 4. So you have 16 120 millimeter fans and what looks like a car radiator at this point, to just continue to be ridiculous with the amount of heat that it can dissipate. At that point, limiting, the only thing holding back the temperature is going to be the transfer rate between the object itself and any cold plate touching it. There's a mathematical transfer rate that happens there as well that has limitations. So there becomes a point where you exceed the transfer rate, which means your coolant and your components will never get any colder no matter how much you add, because you've now created a situation where no matter how much heat goes into the loop, it's never above ambient. And you can only go down to ambient with water cooling and air going through it, because it can only get as cold as the air going through the radiator itself. So it can easily spiral out of control when it comes to cost. However, you can grow your system to meet your needs. If you decide like I want to throw my GPU in the loop later, you can. If you decide later you want to upgrade your radiator to something with higher TDP because you decided you went from an old GPU, now you want to run like a 4090 or something a couple gens in the future because new stuff's out and it's affordable. So that 4090, 5 years from now, is still going to be 450 to 600 watts depending on how it's set up. And you know what doesn't change? Physics. It will still take the amount of effort and energy it takes to cool it today, 5 years in the future. Because I don't think our radiator setups and stuff are going to be changing in the future. This type of heat exchanger has existed for well over 100 years because right now it's the most efficient way to kind of create it in a consumer type of product. So as you can see, it definitely goes from small, medium, large, and each one of them have their pros and their cons. Water cooling for quite a while there was starting to become less and less and less relevant because chips and GPUs like CPUs and silicon, especially when it comes to like 30 series stuff, was just getting more and more power efficient. But it feels like the last couple generations for both CPU and the most recent generation for GPU have just thrown all thermal efficiency to the wind and said, let's just make giant coolers and put tons of watts and tons of heat into it, which now kind of makes water cooling somewhat relevant, or even more relevant than it has been in a long time, because of the fact that it sometimes takes ridiculous setups like this to get any slight overclock to run at a reasonable temperature. But anyway, there we go. I wanted to do this video to kind of give you guys some food for thought regarding systems. I'll give you my final recommendation on who should buy what. If you were like, I need it to work, I need it to be reliable, I don't want to have to touch it or think about it or whatever, an air cooler is the best way to go for you. You're more than likely not overclocking, and you more than likely are not caring about squeezing out every ounce of performance you possibly can from your CPU. You just need it to work. For whatever reason that might be, for work purposes or just for gaming purposes, or the fact that you do not care about tinkering and playing and getting the most out of your system, it just has to work, air cooler is for you. The only thing you have to worry about doing is blowing the dust out of it from time to time. That's the worst thing you'd have to deal with the exception of a fan bearing starting to rattle or go bad. But all of these things have fans, so that applies to all of them. If you're the person that's like, I want my system to be, I paid for a K SKU Intel, I want to get all of my overclock and I want to get all of my additional boost clock available to it, then I would highly recommend going with an AIO because of the fact that you can get very good AIOs that are going to last for many, many years and give you better temperatures than most air coolers in the same price category. Yes, I know that probably triggered some people right there saying, the Noctua will do just fine. But if you're also an enthusiast, it's like, I like to do custom stuff, I like it to be extra, over the top, then yes, an AIO will give you that extra push that you're sort of looking for to have, like you like the way the industrial looks with tubes and stuff are, then an AIO is the best place to start with liquid cooling without having to worry about maintaining it. The only thing you have to do with this as well is blow any of the dust out of the radiator and such, and then listen for any bubbles and percolation, aquarium sounds happening in there, which will be the first indicator that through permeation, you're starting to lose fluid in your system. They're getting better, and they're lasting 5+ years now, but an air cooler would definitely last longer than 5 years. If you're just like, I don't care, I want to throw money at the wall, see what sticks, and do something fun with my computer that's got much diminished returns versus any of these other coolers, then open loop is for you. You've probably already determined that, and you probably have already made up your mind at this point that this is what you would want to do. But with that, you take on all the risks of maintaining it, assembling it, make sure all the parts are compatible and such. Unless you go with an open loop kit, you're responsible for every bit of it. If something goes wrong, let's just say I've got this Corsair block, and I've got this EK Rad, and I've got this Alpha Cool reservoir here, and I've got this, I forgot what brand this is. Oh, you got this Bike Ski pump. You got 4 different manufacturer warranties now to keep track of and then deal with if something were to go wrong with it. But if you're an enthusiast level like I am when it comes to water cooling, it's something you assume the risk of, and you're okay with that. It's kind of like modifying your car. Your warranty is void at that point, but you're okay with that. You signed up for it. And when something goes wrong, you just say fuck like the rest of us. So this is where you guys sound off down below, and I love the arguments that take place. Is it worth it to do water cooling at all? Is it worth it to do an AIO? Are you like, hell no, I will never do water cooling, or hell no, I will never do air cooling? Sound off down below what your cooler type is in your system and your logic behind it. And then defend your opinion like your life depends on it, because it might.